I'm a person who's a bit obsessive about guitar tone because it makes what I do easier. If you haven't seen any videos from this channel before, this channel is called Thirsty Deer Studio. Welcome. I make music under the artist name Thirsty Deer. There's a lot of music out on the streaming platforms. Go check it out. But having a good guitar tone makes things so much easier when you're making music because it brings out things in your playing that are creative, quite frankly. And there's great amps here in my studio. Back there is a 1967 Fender Twin, a vintage Twin. That's the Beatles Get Back amp. And right here behind the camera is a 100-watt 4x12 Mesa Tremoverb dual rectifier. So I use those two amps to give me the guitar tones for my music. I'm also a father to a 4-year-old, and he can sleep through anything. So I crank those amps up, not too loud, but I turn them on and turn them up while he's asleep. He can sleep through them, but when it's getting closer for time to him to wake up, I'm playing and practicing a lot through digital amp simulations. And having these old amps has made getting tones through those amp sims a little bit frustrating, but I feel like it's also given me a unique perspective, and I think I can bring out tones in the sims using other tools better because I do have the old amplifiers. And I'm going to share some of those tips that I use to get great guitar tones out of the amp sims in this video. That intro clip you heard, it's a pretty simple chain. That was just my 54 reissue Les Paul going into a Warm Audio Centavo. If you have a Klein clone, any Klein clone is going to sound about the same. And then going into the Jims 45. But in between the Klein clone and the 45, I have a Strymon Flint. And we know that reverb can make things sound better, especially if you're dealing with amp sims. But what I do, there wasn't any reverb on the amp sim in that. I'm using the harmonic tremolo barely on. You can barely hear it if you really listen for it in that clip. If you watch the beginning of the video, you probably didn't even notice it was on. I have the settings down very low, probably the intensity no higher than 10 o'clock. And this just brings out more harmonics in your playing like an amplifier has. An amplifier is hitting all kinds of overtones. I love the dual rectifier back there because it'll feed back if I hit a note and just hold it right, especially when I'm sitting right here at my mixing station, the amp's right beside it, and it'll just feed back, and that works its way into my music many times. Now, your amp sims aren't going to do that, but you can really bring out those harmonics with the Strymon Flint. And I've got some other tips in this video that I want to share with you to get you thinking about your amp tone, your amp sim tone, in maybe a different way. And there's some things that some other YouTubers have touched on, things about gain staging and how you're running into your interface that can help as well. We're going to discuss all of that in this video. Everything that I've recorded in the past 6 months that's been through a digital amp sim and made it onto my music, there hasn't been many, but there's been a couple, have been through that Flint harmonic tremolo, not even noticeable. I played one solo on a song and you couldn't even tell it was on, but it's doing a really great thing. If you don't have the Flint, like a Harmonious Monk, a Nightwire from Earthquaker, anything with harmonic trim, and even if you don't have harmonic trim at all, if you use like a tube tremolo or like a Boss tremolo pedal, these are kind of simulating like the tube tremolo from later Fender amps from the Blackface and Silverface eras. And it's giving you that movement as well. I advise to keep it on really lightly unless you're going for that tremolo effect. But anything you do to give movement to your sound is going to add a bit of harmonics. And that's what an amp in the room is doing. It's giving you overtones and harmonics and saturation. And that saturation is giving you more personality in your sound. So everything we're talking about here is to get you closer to that sound of an amp in the room. And speaking of that, I highly advise you to play through studio monitors or through an FRFR instead of monitoring on your headphones. Instead of getting a blast straight into your brain through your ear hole, you're getting more of the feel of the room this way. Let's jump back into another sound clip. This is the same chain, the 54 Les Paul going into the Klon clone, into the Flint with just that little bit of harmonic trim, and then into the Gems 45. Check it out. Before that last sound example, I touched a little bit on playing through your studio monitors or an FRFR. But another tip to get the most out of your amp sim pedals is to disconnect the speaker simulation in those, or the impulse response in those, and play through a plug-in impulse response. On the Gems 45, you have a choice of going DI out, which is giving you the speaker simulation, or you can go out without any speaker simulation, just getting the preamp and the power amp and no speaker. And I'll do this a lot of times, and I'll usually use the Shure PT100. It's a plug-in Alliance plug-in, or UA, and it's the Pete Thorn model amplifier. And there's some great impulse responses in there. And on the plug-in, you can disconnect the preamp, power amp, and just run through the impulse responses. There's a list of them. It's really probably 150, 200 speaker cabinets and speakers you can use, and it's really a good way to give you a different sound. Also, if you're getting too bright of a sound through your amp sim pedal or plug-in, you can stack impulse responses. This will darken up the sound a little bit. Some people think it makes it closer to a real amp. I've heard Bumblefoot say this, that he'll stack up speaker sims to cut out that top end. You could also do it with a low pass filter if you're mixing. That's a big problem with digital, that it's a little bright and harsh, especially if you're using interface preamps, stuff like that. You've got a really bright sound going on. We're going to talk a little bit about using DIs or external mic preamps in the video a little bit later, but stack up those speaker sims, try that out, see what that does for you. Also, disconnect the impulse responses on your pedal and try the ones on a plug-in, or like the Celestion impulse responses in the computer. Try some of these things out. It's going to get you closer to the real amp. You can even stack those. Just experiment a lot. This is how you stumble onto things. Anything with modulation, like I was talking about the harmonic tremolo, but you can use other forms of light modulation to give you a little bit of movement and make that sound closer to an amplifier. Let's talk about input signals, both level into the plugins and how you actually get in physically through your DI or your mic preamp, whatever you use. I have here BAE 1073. This is the MP without the EQ. It's basically a Neve 1272 line amp. It's really rich, really fat, great low end. I usually always use that on bass and on kick drum when I'm recording. And up here I have Chandler TG2s lately. These have been how I've been going in with the guitar. You have DIs on the front. You can see this is where the Gems 45 is going in. When when I used to go in through this Focusrite 18i20, I would go in and I would use this 1073 in a plug-in because the Focusrite is so clean. It's giving you all these frequencies with no harmonics. Once again, it goes back to harmonics and overtones, and all of the things that these two high-end preamps give you are just very musical. It's giving you a little bit of compression. It's cutting out the bad frequencies that you would have to go in and cut with EQ or use a plug-in. And if you can get a higher end DI or mic preamp and go in that way, you're gonna find a noticeable difference. And you don't have to do it this way. You can use a plug-in, but you need some kind of analog input on the signal. I think it's always a good idea to put a channel strip on your guitar channel first in the computer, because even if you're using analog hardware such as this, maybe you don't have a high pass filter, and I always high pass my guitar tones. Also, it's just a good idea in general. You might find somewhere in your recording that you've got a little bit of noise that you want to cut out, and there's usually a gate built into those channel strips. With guitars, I don't always EQ a lot on the channel strips. I try and get the tone as I'm going in. But with the amp sims, especially if you don't have this analog hardware, that channel strip first, even before the guitar sim plug-in, if you're running in DI, is just gonna add some musicality to the channel and make the guitar sound better, in my opinion. Let's talk about running into plugins. There's been some videos out about this. It's kind of been in the guitar world news lately, because these plugin manufacturers didn't really talk about how to set your input running into them, and a lot of people are running them hot. That'll give you a sound. Maybe you want it hot, but usually things feel a lot better to me if you knock some dBs off that input. I usually set mine for like that Pete Thorn channel strip, even if I'm just using the impulse responses. There's an input, I think it's called the power soak, and an output. And I usually put the input down on -12, and I do the same thing with the neural plugins. Drop that down to -12. Those are really the two I use the most. You need to just experiment. If things feel hot going in, knock that input down. Usually on most of them, -12 feels good to me, but you can go anywhere from -18 to -6, just depending on what you're going for. But that's something to definitely keep in mind, because your guitar is going to be hitting things too hot if you leave those set at 0 in many instances. I hope you got something out of this video. A lot of these things to do with modulation, experiment. I'm using harmonic tremolo and tremolo, but try very light chorus or univibe. All these things, maybe those effects aren't what you're going for, but a lot of times a very subtle chorus is hardly noticeable. Univibe can be a cool thing on its own and just give you a different tone going into the sims. I like guitar pedals in front of amp sims. I think they give it that extra push. And this Gems 45 has a boost on it. It sounds good like that, but I like running guitar pedals in. Think about different modulations. Those are really gonna help bring out some of the overtones like an amp would do. Try and run into the computer with as good of signal as you can. Get you a good DI box, or if you have a good preamp, use it. And think about your input staging if you're using plugins. These are the top things that I've learned doing this for quite a while now to get my guitar amp simulated tone as close to the real amplifiers that I have here as possible. And I've been doing it a while, and my opinion on things has changed a bit because I have gotten some good tones out of the amp sims. I still will most every time go through the amps, but there is usable sounds, very usable sounds for recording with amp simulations.